For tonight, we'd like to thank Milwaukee-based psychotherapist Julianne Manske Rollefson for joining us tonight as our conversation partner for this event. And for who Julianne will be conversing with for tonight. On her mission to combat pre-existing notions and misguided narratives about grief, she has spread her wisdom in many forms, from the college classrooms to TEDx Talks to her own podcast, which is 5 seasons ongoing. Congratulations. And now to our local bookstore. We here at Boswell are pleased to welcome Lisa Keefauver.
Hello, everybody. In case anybody can't see from the back, there is empty seats up front. Just telling you, just letting you know.
Well, I would also like to really thank Lisa for coming. She's here all the way from San Diego. It's her first time to Milwaukee, so thank you for giving her such a nice welcome.
Definitely not my last. This is gorgeous.
So thank you guys for showing up. And I am just really honored that Lisa is here. I have listened to her podcast from the very beginning. She is someone I've looked to for grief guidance, and her book, if you haven't read it yet, I hope you'll get it. It has everything that she's ever said about grief, kind of in an easy to digest, very comprehensive, very compassionate way. So where I want to start tonight is, as those of you know who have gotten into the world of grief, we know that there is a certain language to grief, and there are terms that you only learn once you kind of come over to this side. One of those terms is grief anniversary. And that is the anniversary of a death or a loss. And I know that Lisa has a grief anniversary that is very present right now. And if you would be willing to share what that is and what that has to do with your entrance into the world of grief and loss.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for turning out Milwaukee. Can you give yourselves a round of applause? Check out this crowd. Okay. Milwaukee knows what's up. Yeah, I know nobody grows up thinking I'm going to grow up and be a grief activist. So not something that I thought about doing as a young person. And even though I got my training in social work and was working with humans, which meant I was working with grievers, I really didn't understand what grief was. And August is a griefy month coming up. That's what I call it. If you've got one of those, you can call it a griefy season or a griefy time. Were you referring to today's particular grief anniversary? Yeah, so oftentimes it's the anniversary of a death. If your grief is over a death, which I want to acknowledge and remind that we can grieve over many kinds of losses, even non-death losses. And the 16th of August is the day that my husband died in my arms. But today is a grief anniversary that really hit me hard. And it's the day that I got the call from my husband telling me to meet him in the emergency room, because after a year of misdiagnosis, they finally ran a scan. And I showed up to find out that he had a grapefruit-sized brain tumor that had shifted his brainstem. And he died in my arms 18 days later. And it'll be 13 years. It was 13 years ago today. And I know for all of you who have experienced loss, that can feel like a lifetime ago and yesterday all at the same time somehow. And it's not been lost on me on this whole grief book tour that I've been on since the launch of my book on June 4th. Just that though I would be still in the helping profession, I wouldn't be the person I am if I hadn't had the love of Eric in my life, but also if I hadn't lost Eric too. So therein lies, grief is a sneaky bitch.
Yeah, and one of the terms that comes to mind from your book is smying, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But I think you've had a lot of those smying moments on tour because you have this book.
We might have one tonight. It could happen.
And it's when you're smiling and crying and all of these things can happen at once because you have this book and you have this tour and you have all these lovely people coming out to see you. And I know you would love to share it with Eric.
He would be definitely sitting in the front row. Also, kudos to people who came and sat in the front row, extra credit points. And she's wearing a Go Blue. So extra. Sorry, I don't know. I know. I didn't say that. I'd love Go Badger. What? Wisconsin.
Another one of those grief terms that we know very well is secondary loss. And many of you have probably heard of that, but some of you might not have. And secondary loss, as you say in your book very accurately, is the sneakiest bitch of all. Because you have this big loss, whether it's a death or another type of loss, and everyone gathers and everyone supports you. or some people support you and some people might not, but then there are all of these other losses that come along with it. And it could be loss of financial security. You might have a loss of your job. You might have a loss of your home. There are so many other things that come. And the one I wanted to focus on, since we're talking about Eric, was relational and the loss of identities that are related to other people. And so I know we have some motherless daughters in the crowd, and we have other ways that we relate to people and that we lose that sense of relationship. And you walked through the world as Eric's wife for a long time. And so I'd love to hear your experience with that sort of secondary loss that's relational.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Secondary losses are the sneakiest bitches of them all, is what I chapter in the book. Is anybody else hearing that little high-pitched squeak? Yeah, you are. I don't know if Alex or anybody else is nearby that could help us. It's meant because we asked to scoot back. Is that why? It's our fault. Do you want us to scoot forward? Okay. We're going to scoot forward onto the death lights under here. So I'm 53. This is not a flattering look, but anyhow, for you all, so that we don't have to hear high-pitched squeak, I will come sit under the, is that any better?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. See what I do for you, Milwaukee? Anyhow. Alex is on it. Don't worry, you guys. We're going to just keep chatting while Alex is working on that. So secondary losses, they are practical. Sometimes they are like I had to sell my house and move because I couldn't afford to live where I lived, right? I had to change jobs because I couldn't be an 80-hour-a-week clinical director of a nonprofit with a 7-year-old daughter at home. So there were some practical things that we all have to lose. But I think one of the reasons that secondary losses feel so complicated is they don't show up in the beginning always, and they show up over time. And also, as to your point, that people don't recognize them, in part because we don't recognize them ourselves. And some of them are the ambiguous losses. So you'll hear a lot of terms, as you'll read about them in the book. Secondary losses and ambiguous losses can overlap, which are like the dreams that you had with your person that you don't get to carry with you anymore, and their relationships, and to your point, Julianne, the identity that we lose. I consider myself lots of things: a friend, a daughter, a mother, right? I was a clinical director, I was a social worker, but I was also a wife and a partner to Eric. And to lose that relationship in that way, although I still really believe that I still have a relationship with Eric and I carry him with me, it's not the same as having a relationship in the world. Grief, as I talked about in my TED Talk and definitely in this book, is not just emotions. It has a spiritual, relational, cognitive, physical, emotional impact on our lives. And that relational, often losses are the ones that show up down the road. So not just the person and your own identity. So I lost myself too. I've spent the last 13 years discovering who I am again in the world, but certainly also lost some friendships for people who didn't know how to show up. I lost some community. I lost a sense of self. So, and I know I speak for so many of us who experience that, but I think to name it for yourself and to those that you love, if you're showing up as a grief supporter, can be so powerful. You don't have to fix it, just to name it. But I remember a first friend saying to me, like, it's got to be, because it was 8 couples and then 7 couples and Lisa. You know what I mean? I was like the hanger on her. And I remember one of my friends early on in the first, after we went to, they invited me to a party and it was all couples and Lisa. And then we went to take the picture, and, it was a whole awkward thing. I'm crying, trying not to cry. And she said, it's got to be hard to not be a wife in the world anymore. And that was so meaningful to me. She couldn't fix it, but it was so meaningful.
Yeah, I think when people are able to name something specifically that we're feeling, and that's why, like, when you read this book, I hope that you experience a lot of that. I know I did. And the one I reference most since reading it is the way that you talk about homesickness, and it's related to the secondary losses, but there's the way that you talk about homesickness being like specifically related to grief, in that we define a sense of home with these people that we're really close to, and that's where we find our home. And so there's this sense that when those attachments are gone in the way that they were always there, we don't really know where home is anymore. And my question for you is a big one, but it's around, how did you, when you were feeling that sense of homesickness, how have you over the years kind of found your way back to a sense of home?
That's a good question. See why I'm friends with her? And I invited her here tonight. How many people can relate to that feeling of homesickness and loss, or sort of feeling untethered to the world? Yeah, yeah. And to your point, really, it's because we have formed an attachment, which is, what we're meant to do as humans, to form these attachment bonds to people. And our story, and the story we tell about ourselves, the story we tell about our future, is so tied up in somebody, that it's hard to orient ourselves in the world. I have to admit, in the beginning, I don't think I did I don't think was adept at figuring out how to find home. As I mentioned, I had to sell our physical home within the first year because I couldn't afford to have a home with, one paycheck as a social worker. This is going to come as a shock, but we don't make a lot of money. And you can tell I use humor to deflect sadness. Have you noticed that too? Humor and swearing, my go-to coping mechanisms. But I think one of the things I'll say that I figured, and so I moved there, but then I left Ann Arbor and moved to Austin and lived there for a while. And I've done a lot of, geographical cure, kind of attempts at finding my way in the world. But I think it's when I think part of what I started to do is recognize, even the first thing I started to do was recognize that I felt homesick for him. And that wasn't just about quote unquote missing him, that it was really about a homesickness that I felt. I didn't use that language till later. In the beginning, what I would say to people is I feel so untethered. I feel so untethered to the world, to my place in the world, to myself. I really felt untethered to myself. I have been a practitioner of yoga for 25 years, so certainly a yoga practice helped. For me, one of the things that I have started to use and still use to this day when I feel sort of homesick for me and my place in the world is a mindfulness practice. I know. You're like, oh my God, here's another person talking about mindfulness. But it's free and available to you 24/7, and you can use it anywhere. So like, what better resource is that? And that's really helped me. And it literally sometimes just looks like when I feel homesick and untethered, I literally look down and feel the sensation of the earth beneath me and rock my feet back and forth and place my hand on my heart. You will often see me in places standing like this. It's not always a sign that I've felt homesick, but sometimes that's my way of grounding back to myself. And that really, of course, I've been in talk therapy, I've been in trauma therapy, I have great support friends and all the things, and have done a lot of ritual, but really a mindfulness practice of remembering that I am here and I am home. And to say that to myself has been probably my most used skill and resource.
It's a good one. And it reminds me as you're talking about it. So those of you who haven't gotten to hear Lisa speak before or read the book, what I loved about the book, knowing you through your podcast for so long, is it has your voice. Exactly. So who you're hearing now is the voice that you'll hear in the book. And the great thing about that is you're really honest. And I bring that up because, I read this book even being, 7 and 9 years out from my biggest losses. And still, there are different things that you're ready for at different times. And that's why when she says mindfulness, you might be like, no, thank you. Or it might be, you're just not ready at this point to say like, I need to know why this happened, or I need to just be angry for a while. And you give people permission throughout the book of saying like, okay, if this isn't where you are right now, you can be there and that's okay. And come back to this chapter. And in 2 years, it's going to look different. And it's one of those books that you can kind of keep going back to. And one of the places I used to get really stuck is around finding meaning. I don't know if any of you have heard that, but it's find meaning in the loss. And that was something that just really rubbed me the wrong way. And I think it was because it feels like a platitude in a way. It feels like find the silver lining, right? Like everything happens for a reason, which you also talk about in the book, right? No, thank you. But your book offers something I found really helpful, which ties back to the importance of kind of redefining our narrative, kind of we decide what the meaning looks like. And you say the chance to find meaning lives in the space before you tell the story. What does that mean?
Ooh, see, you guys are lucky. My last co-author in Boston made me read the poem in the space before the story. So you don't get to hear my poem tonight. You can just read it for yourselves. The space before the story and finding meaning is really ties back to how I've shown up in the world personally and professionally since I went to graduate school. So there's a particular practice called narrative therapy, which felt very home to me when I found it back in 2002. And I think in that way, what I recognize is that there is no truth in the world with a capital T. There's the truth of the story that we tell ourselves about the thing that happened. And that is not to diminish that a hard thing happened and a horrible thing happened. I mean, my husband stopped breathing and he died. That's a fact. But the story I tell about his illness and his death has a real world impact on how I experience grief in the wake of his illness and his death. And that doesn't mean I went quickly to finding the silver lining, like, so grateful that it happened. And you never have to get there, right? But the space before the story is really about one of my most used recommended tools when I work with individuals and companies and myself when I work with myself, because I do a lot of self-work too, which is pause. Pause. We all have narratives that we tell ourselves that have become on automatic pilot. Oftentimes, they're the stories that we've either said out loud over and over again that have gone unchecked by the people in our lives. And oftentimes, they're the narratives of our broader culture, which is why I spend so much time in the book talking about that. Or they're the narratives that other people have said to us about our own experience, you know, those pity sayings and all those things. And then they become true with a capital T the more we say them about ourselves. And the pause or the space before the story is an invitation along your grief journey, wherever you are, whatever it is get curious about the places that you feel stuck, right? What are the places or certain emotions or certain memories or certain experiences? And then if you pause, you might listen inward to the stories that you're telling yourself. It might be the stories you tell your girlfriend or your friend over and over again, but often they're the stories that play in your head. I'm not the only one, right? We all have stories that are playing in our heads over and over again, right? And often those stories have very limiting beliefs. They have the word should and shouldn't in them, right? And they get us in a stuck place. And so that space before the story is an invitation for anywhere you are in your grief, 2 weeks, 2 years, 20 years, when you're feeling stuck, and it applies to other areas of our life, career goals, family goals, right? Is to pause and think about what are the stories that are being telling, because there is another story you could tell. And that story isn't everything happens for a reason, because gross. That's not the story, but the story might be this horrible thing happened. And so my favorite word is and, right? And what have I learned since then? What do I know? How has death made me get really clear about what I value in life and how I spend my time, right? So pause. That's the space before the story that we can all benefit from. It gives us a chance to have a different relationship with our grief, which is what we do. We're in a relationship with our grief.
It is so helpful and hard to do in the moment, but very helpful and a good practice to get into. And I also want to get into the grief activism, because you were just talking about the own beliefs that we carry, and we carry these things and we carry these stories, but so many of those are also cultural, right? We can't escape it. There are things that just keep us kind of narrow in the way that our culture lets us think about grief, that our culture lets us grieve, that we support people in grief. And I was thinking it really specifically because, you know, you now live on the West Coast. You've been doing your book tour everywhere. You grew up in the Midwest. We're in the Midwest now.
Midwest.
And Midwest has certain cultures with it, right? It's going to look a little different for all of us, but there's a little bit of a Midwest nice, and we're very kind, and we'll bring you a casserole. But then we might be a little uncomfortable if you start to cry, right? Like we might be a little, or if you start to yell,
Just back
or
away
if
slowly.
there are a lot of things that like we just don't necessarily do well. And obviously I'm making a huge stereotype here. But the bigger question is around like, what can we do when we have these big cultural beliefs? Like, how can we start to break free from those? And what is your work in the world? Like, how are you trying to break those cultural beliefs a little bit?
Yeah, this is probably the theme of kind of really the broadest theme of my work as a grief activist, whether it's being a professor of loss and grief or the TED Talk or my show or even in this book. Um, we are grief illiterate, which is our fault, and yet it's not our fault, but it's our responsibility to do something about. Right. So we grew up in the West, anyways, I'll say, in a pretty grief illiterate culture, not just the Midwest, although definitely, I mean, I will say this about myself as a Midwestern, definitely nice, polite, don't like want to cause trouble or make a scene. Right. And so even in my early grief, I would try to hide my tears and which now I look back, I was like, of course I was a raging, crying, crazy mess. Like, duh. But at the time I didn't. So why so we live in this broader culture. We live in a culture of capitalism, which emphasizes productivity and production. We live in a culture that tells the myth of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, which actually isn't the history of our country, but anyhow, right? So we live in this broader culture, and we also live in a very secular culture, and we now live at a time where we're all very spread apart from the communities of care that we might have naturally had a generation ago, 2 generations ago, and so forth. And so just to name that again, I think is an important thing. You'll see that theme throughout my work. I think there's just real value in naming. Like, of course, I maybe didn't show up because, by the way, when my husband died, the year before, one of my best friend's mother had been killed in an accident by the father in a boating accident. And I looked back and thought, I did not show up for her the way that I would now. Right. So even though I'm going to give you all these words of wisdom, I have not walked this walk too, because I was the child of a child of a father who survived the Holocaust and has never talked about it since. I was a child of a mother who survived adoption and trauma and abuse and never talked about it. They never talked about it. So how would I know? Right. So to get to the part of what do we do about it? Unfortunately, I think, and maybe you all are those people in this room, for many of us, we don't really figure out what to do about it until it's us, until everybody else's niceness keeps them from showing up for us or from creating safe spaces where they can hold and be a container for our pain and our anger and our rage and our sorrow and even our joy, by the way. People don't know how to show up if you have joy in the midst of your grief because they don't understand that you can have both things at the same time. So one of the ways in which we do it is we get better at doing it for other people. Sorry, I know we want to be the receivers first. But part of how I really did it is, and that's why I do the work I do, I try to model holding space and bearing witness for other people's pain. That was my graduate thesis 20 something years ago, right? So how do we hold space for other people's pain? So how do we show up and not try to fix them? Because grief is not a sign that you're broken and you don't need fixing, right? So I think we try to do that for other people. And if there are people in your life who have historically has shown you that they take constructive criticism, only if you know they have that capacity, you can say to them, I know you probably don't know any better, and I didn't either before I became a griever, but it's really important for me for you to just be in the room while I cry. You don't have to do anything. Try not to cringe visibly. You can cringe internally if you need to, right? And just hold space for me.
Yeah.
And I definitely have done that over the years. Like, I know you mean well, and yeah.
I think one of the hardest things about grief illiteracy, being grief averse in general as a culture is, I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things for me as a grief therapist is almost everyone, and tell me if you experience this, almost everyone who comes into my office at some point tells me that they're doing it wrong. They think that they're doing grief wrong, and it's heartbreaking. And it's because no one talks about it. No one shares their experience of doing it. And so that's why I'm so glad that we're having these conversations, because then we can look around and see other people who are just trying to figure it out along with us. And I think recognition of our experience and other grievers is so important. As I was thinking about this, you can kind of sometimes tell the difference between people who have had like a big loss and people who haven't. And I was at the grocery store the other day and I was grabbing eggs. And I check, do you open the eggs and you check and you make sure that they're all not broken? And I saw someone just grab some eggs and throw them in their cart. And I was like, oh, nope, that's someone who has not experienced loss. They are very confident about walking through the world and having nothing bad happen to them, because I'm sure there's going to be a broken egg in mine, right? I got to check. And so I think, it's really interesting, just the recognition we can have in others when you see someone and you're like, it's why we connected so quickly. It's why we have this community of grief workers here in Milwaukee. We have it too. And so what do you think the importance is of kind of finding those connections? And yeah.
Oh, I think it can really be everything. And I think it can take time. You know, going places and seeing people is exhausting in grief, right? It can be exhausting. And yet you're so isolated. You need people so badly. And yet people are problematic sometimes. I mean, not just in grief, but right? And so I do think it's hard, and I think the answer is going to be different for each of us. Some of you maybe already have built-in people in your life who, even if they didn't know how to do it before, somehow walk with you and figure out how to show up for you in the ways that you need it. Because by the way you need it is going to look different than the way you need it, and you need it based on a whole factor of things. Although I'm going to do an event in Ann Arbor next week, so my answer is going to change a little bit when all of my ladies are there in the audience with me. But they were amazing, and they showed up, and they took turns taking me out once a week so that I could cry in a restaurant in public with them. It was fun, and they brought me casseroles, and they, took my daughter and took care of her, took her to camp. Right? They were amazing. It really wasn't until I met my now best friend, Solstice sister, about a year later, who had experienced the full-term stillbirth of her daughter and who had really experienced a profound loss, to find the person that I could just go be in a room with. And also, she hadn't experienced the loss of Eric. So all of my girlfriends lost Eric too. And so that's the thing. Sometimes the people in your life who you would want to turn towards just can't be there, not for any maliciousness, and not even maybe because of any incapacity, but because they're dealing with their grief too. So that was my first sort of sign that, it matters to have at least one person in your life where you can show up and you don't even have to say anything. You can just show them the date on the calendar, or you can give them a look, or you can just say it's a griefy kind of day or whatever. And if we can even find one of them, which you might find in a grief support group, you might find at a book club, you might find in your neighborhood, you might find it all kinds of places. I met that friend because I dared to go to an event that had dancing, because I love to dance. And someone introduced Autumn to me by saying, "That's Lisa. She's the woman whose husband died." I'm not joking. You can't even make this stuff up, right? And my friend looked to that friend and was like, she was like, "Don't do that," right? But having those spaces, because the truth is that comes back to our question of how do we find home? When we can be truly authentically ourselves, even in our mess, even in our destruction, even in our overwhelm, then we can find a moment of feeling at home. And that's like a respite or a balm to the weight of grief, because somebody has come alongside us and helped carry the weight for a minute, for an hour, for a day. And we know they can come alongside and carry the weight for us again. Yeah.
One thing that came up for me as you were talking, that's something we've never talked about, but you write about it in the book, and I've heard you talk about it on the podcast, is your friend Joe. And Joe was another friend that you lost. But you talk about the way that he really showed up. And my curiosity there is, so I don't know how long after Joe died.
4 years. I was with Joe when he died. 4 years after I was with Eric when he died.
So another grief term, disenfranchised grief, is when, you have a loss that maybe other people don't recognize. And because of that, you don't really feel permission to grieve it. And I'm curious about, first of all, you can talk about how Joe showed up for you, because it sounds like he really did. But also, how did that feel different when you had a dear friend who you lost, and people might not have seen how deep of a loss that was for you too?
Yeah, people definitely did. How many people in here have experienced friendship loss? If you want to raise your hand. Yeah, a lot of us, right? And like so many losses, that's not the only one. It's one that just doesn't get a lot of attention. People might say for a minute, "I'm sorry," but they don't quite understand, or any kind of chosen family, right? Loss. Joe was a quirky guy. He had sort of been adopted into my my extended family and come on vacations. He knew Eric very well. He was a good guy, but I wish I'm going to I'll share a picture someday of Joe. Follow me on my social media. You'll see just neck to toe covered in Star Wars tattoos, and loved Billy Joel somehow in his El Camino. And, he just loved his Filipino culture, and he was just a character, but he could be on the phone with me in the middle of the night when I was crying and didn't try to do it. And he would send me funny memes, even when I wasn't ready to laugh, knowing that I would need those memes in my text thread, right, when I was ready to laugh. And the first time I did laugh, and he happened to be on the phone with me, and then I burst into tears because I felt so bad about laughing and what a horrible wife I was that I could laugh again. He was there to remind me that I was okay, and it did. I had moved to Texas, created a nonprofit to help cancer patients, ironically. And I was working there when I had to leave quickly and go to the hospital. He had muscular dystrophy, and we knew he was in a decline. And when I came back to work literally the next day, they asked me about Joe, and then that was it. Nobody asked me to tell story, even though like my work as the head of this nonprofit was telling my own personal story about Eric. Still, these people didn't know to ask me the stories about Joe and how Joe was there for me. And, I just got to tell this story just since you brought up Joe. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. So as I said, Joe was a character. He was a real kooky guy, and didn't like to admit that he cared about people, but he did. He was one of those like curmudgeon people who's like, he really liked you, but he didn't want to let you know. And I got to the hospital, and my brother was there, who was very good friends with him, and another friend. And we soon realized this was probably, going to be the end. Didn't quite know, but my husband died after a surgery and was in a coma. So when we decided to take him off life support, and he died in my arms about 8 hours later, I didn't get to say anything to him, and he didn't get to say anything to me. And that always really haunted me. I saw him post-op, and he still had his voice and was still awake. So I got to like have a little I love you moment. And he said he loved our daughter. But when I was with Joe, I got to have something that I've been trying to talk about years later, about the gift of this friendship, which is why the grief over Joe, I think people don't quite get, is Joe, very weak, I was holding his hand, and he looked at me and said, "Lisa, it's time for me to go. I'm going to cry." See, smiling and crying. I'm going to do it right now. He said, "It's time for me to go, Lisa." And I said, "I know, it's okay, Joe. I love you. We're here. It's okay if you go." And he said, "No, you don't understand. It's time for me to go." And I said, "I know. It's okay. I'm here. We're going to be here for you." And I swear within 10 seconds, he passed. And I will never forget that gift. And if I hadn't been willing to show up for that hard thing, which was watching somebody else in my life die, not only would I have regretted that, but I wouldn't have gotten the gift that he gave me. And so when people ask me, like, isn't it hard to do grief work, or isn't it hard to show up at the bedside of somebody who's dying? I say yes, because yes, and the people, when we're able to show up and be friends for people or be there for the hard thing, you never know the gift that experience is going to give you. I know I went way offline on that and answering that question, but I couldn't not tell you about Joe and what a special person he was. Yeah. Yay, Joe. He would be like, "Oh, you guys, stop making a fuss."
Oh, thank you for sharing that. There is something about being close to death and getting close to grief that you can't help but explore spirituality, right? It brings up all of the biggest questions. It's hard to get away from that. And you talk about grief being a spiritual thing too. And we have a lot of we fangirl over a lot of the same people, and Krista Tippett is one of them. I don't know if anyone knows On Being.
Anybody know On Being podcast?
Wonderful podcast.
Besides our podcast. Listen to her.
But she talks about the comfort she takes in the fact that, and you write about this in the book, the fact that humans are just the most complex creatures, right? And the complexity that we'll never really know, right? There are always going to be questions we don't have the answers to. And she talks about spiritual life is a way of dwelling with that perplexity and kind of being in that space of perplexity and taking it seriously. And I love that. And although I teach a lot about what grief does to the brain and the body and everything, the spiritual piece is what I'm most interested in. It's what's most fascinating to me. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you, what has the spiritual journey been for you? What have you learned spiritually through your grief.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not sure that I have an answer for this one, except I'm going to YOLO my way through it. I do think the spiritual or the existential that we might think about is one of the most interesting things about grieving. And also back to what I was saying before, which is if we can, again, not because everything happens for a reason or find meaning, blah, 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 but if we can use our soul, our intellect, the breath, the life that we have left, because we're still here breathing, even though in early grief, we wish we weren't sometimes too, right? I want to recognize that. And to dwell on what does it mean to be here? What is the gift about being here? What do I want to do with the time that I have here? I grew up in a non-religious family, so I didn't have any sort of, not that spirituality is always religious, but I didn't have, my dad was an agnostic Jew. My mom was a Midwest Episcopalian-ish kind of person. We didn't have, I went to whoever I had a sleepover at, that's where I went to church or synagogue or temple the next day, kind of. And so I did actually struggle really spiritually early on because I really wished that I had although I know many religious people who that really caused them to question their faith, but I had some time where I felt very rageful that I didn't have a story about what happens, right? And I didn't have some spiritual practice to lean on, especially because our daughter was 7. I wanted to also, she had a lot of questions, too. So I think for me, spirituality is going to be, it has been over time tied up with a more humanistic, or maybe, the Unitarian Universalist in the room. It's really about showing up of how do I make meaning in the world with what I have left. And that's what I've really leaned on. I do mindfulness and meditation, which I think of as a prayer. I mean, if you might think about it that way, it's a prayer that I say. I have a practice where for the last 8, it's going to be more than 8 years, maybe 9 years, when my feet hit the floor in the morning, before I stand up, literally before I stand up, I have a mantra that I've said for a while, which I'll keep to myself as my private one. But I say it, and I've started saying, because now I rescued another dog. So I talk to her. She's in my house. And I tell Frankie every morning, okay, it's time to pray. And for a while, I really didn't like using that word because I thought, well, I'm kind of co-opting something and I'm not religious. But having a saying, an intention that I'm setting into my day every day has been actually given me, that's my spiritual practice. Interviewing people and talking with people and supporting people who are having their own curiosity, their own wondering, their own meditating on the uncertainty of life. Because as I think we all learned in the pandemic, it's the myth that we have a certainty in the world, right? And though it can be scary and we want stories to explain everything, and that's a very neurophysiological, biological thing that we want, I've actually found an increased capacity to dwell. And I think that's from my spiritual practice, kind of to dwell in uncertainty, to be curious. It's also a way I carry Eric forward. He was the most curious person I've ever met. And I always try to carry that curiosity. And I think for me, that curiosity and that openness align with what I'm calling for me, my spirituality, and to show up in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love how you talk about legacy. It's like carrying those great qualities and the people that you loved through. And I think sometimes we think like the bad thing happened to me, right? The bad thing happened to me, and now no more bad things are going to happen because I had the thing. And for those of you who don't know, Lisa's had a really hard year. And another bad thing happened to you. And I think it can be tough to not think you're going to have a broken egg every time, right?
Yeah.
To not think like,
I'm going to remember this metaphor for the rest of my life.
but it is. And so it's like, I know you, so I know that you don't get stuck in that negativity bias. You don't walk through.
I visit.
You
visit. I linger.
But I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what you've been through, but also like, yeah, how do you keep seeing the beauty in the world?
Yeah. Well, and I have to admit, and I think I wrote a blog post, maybe I did an episode about this too. I did try to bypass my way out of being in the hard thing there for a while, which we can do too. Sometimes we get stuck and hang out there too long. And sometimes we just think we can gratitude our way past being in the hard thing, right? And then you're like, and then the universe is like, no, you got to go back and visit. Yeah, in case you're new to me and you saw a flyer with a lady with long blonde hair, and then you walked in here and was like, who is this chick up there with her curly hair? 10 days before my manuscript was due to the publisher, I found out I was diagnosed with triple positive breast cancer that had also been misdiagnosed for more than a year. Really, universe? And it was about a month before I was to go give my TEDx talk, which I did. So, yeah, I had some words with the universe, whoever they are, it is, you know. And which I would just have to tell this joke. So I used to get perms in the 80s. Anybody back from the 80s? And because I had straight hair, and I spent so much money on perms, and I just realized that you only need to do 12 straight weeks of chemotherapy to get perms, and 10 out of 10 do not recommend getting your chemo curls this way. But that's why I look like this. This is thanks to chemotherapy. You know, because I was a public figure already at the time that I got diagnosed, and because I had already created a career of sharing my own experience publicly, not too much, but enough to be able to sort of say I've walked the walk and I'm walking along this with you. I kept recording my podcast, even though I was recording bald, no eyebrows, sometimes no eyelashes, very swollen from all the steroids that they were putting me on. Doing the work that was meaningful to me was the really important thing. I'm going to talk about the hard thing and the good thing. The good thing, the thing that survived me, is that I had really meaningful work. I did stop teaching at the university, and I took my one-on-one caseload down, but I kept recording my podcast because being in conversation and sharing those episodes were profoundly important. And because I'm a public figure, I felt a lot of pressure, even though I know better. Just because I say the things to you doesn't mean I follow my own advice. That it was also okay to sit in the suck. And it was also okay to be pissed off that I had cancer, and that came on the heels of some very horrible things that had been happening in my family too. So that was not a totally just one and done new thing that had happened. And I lost myself. Who was I in the world without hair and without a breast and without a lymph node, and not sure about my survival, right? And so through the surgery and the first 6 weeks of chemotherapy, I was out there in the world kind of like, we can do this and it's going to be good. And I'm sad, but I was saying it from a very intellectual place. I was trying to sort of be that half glass full person. And then I just caught myself that I was like, I'm just trying to yes and my way and bypass all the hard things. You know, when somebody would say, this is so horrible, I would just say, yes, but I didn't find out till later, which meant I could move to California and be near my daughter when she needed me, when she was going through a crisis. And they'd say, this is so horrible. I can't believe you lost your husband. And then I would say, yes, but I have meaningful work. And I would just try to toxic positivity myself into making it all okay. Even though I rail at toxic positivity, me and Kate Bowler and the rest of us, right? And it really took a friend again, calling me on my stuff. And then I just had to be there. I had to be there in the rage and the fear. And it didn't last long. That's the thing. Our emotions are temporary visitors. But the more we suppress them, the bigger and outsized they are, and the more they linger around. And so I did as an example, not that you don't owe anybody your story, by the way, but because I had a public audience, I did a reel because I was in tears right before everybody was celebrating when I made it to 6 out of 12 chemos. They're like, oh my God, halfway there, you did it. You're on the other side. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm only halfway there. Oh my God, I can't. I'm the strongest person you know, and I can't. I'm telling you, I can't. Right. And so I went on to say that, and I can't because I'm having to do it without a husband, and nobody's here in the middle of the night when I'm sick and I'm scared and something's going really terribly wrong with my body. Right. But it took saying it to people in my personal life and then to the public life for me to release all of that. And was I scared later on? Yeah, but not as scared. Was I angry later on? Yeah, but not as angry. I really needed to give myself permission to be seen, to see myself, to give myself permission to sit in the suck, to be with the anger, to be with the fear. And that still happens. That's not a one and done, but so many things about this book you'll read are lessons that I've had to learn over and over and over again, because that's what the universe does, right? Like, just when you thought you learned a lesson, the universe is like, practice again, shall we? And that's what it felt like to me. And that was one of the things that this cancer, not a gift, I'm not here to say cancer was a gift. I am here to say that getting cancer at this particular time in my life did offer me that lesson again, which is I just can be with it. I just need to be with all the feelings, and they're not going to stay. And the more I'm with it, the more they're going to dissipate. And I'm done learning that lesson. God,
Give us a break, please. Give her a break. I mean, first of all, so happy you're healthy.
I know, and I'm healthy, and I got a
So
clear
happy you're
scan.
healthy. Best news. And it is. I mean, what you brought up is another thing that happens in therapy offices everywhere is
Yes.
that people say, if I start crying, I'm not going to stop.
I know that fear so well. Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's just, then you do it and you go through it and you feel the wave, and it's not going to stay forever.
No, this is what I always say to my one-on-one clients all the time. And I had to say to myself, not one single emotion you've ever had has lasted. Not one, not the ones we want. Remember the last time you were feeling full of joy, right? And you thought, oh my God, this is the best thing, and I'm always going to feel this way. And it didn't last. But same was the last time you felt really angry or really sorrowful. Do they come back? And in early grief, will they come back with more frequency? You better believe it. But no feeling lasts. And so the reason some of them hang around longer than others is because we try to resist them. And we should all over ourselves. I said should. We should all over ourselves that we shouldn't be feeling that way. And that's that lesson that I think we all, but that's a lesson we have to keep learning, because I also want to be honest. It sucks to feel angry. It sucks to feel scared. It sucks to feel rage, right? Lonely. I mean, I'm not intellectualizing when I know I'm saying it's hard. It's really hard to feel all those feelings, and they pass. And the more we loosen our grip on them. Okay, Michiganders, remember the tow rope? Who learned how to ski with a tow rope, right? Right. And if you held on too high, it jinked you. And if you didn't hold on enough, right? And you had to hold on to that just right amount for it to carry you forward. And that's how I think about how we can be in relationship with our emotions, right? Allow that emotion to move through you, to propel you forward in some way. Yeah, I had to get
It's true.
Nobody in San Diego understood that reference, let me tell you.
And I do want to do a time check. I know we want to be able to offer questions too. Are we good?
For questions, 20 minutes for Q&A? Okay.
Okay, so just keep going. All right.
I mean,
all right, I got more.
yeah, okay. We're going to make time for questions. You guys can start.
There are just so many. I want to make sure
preparing.
people get the chance to talk to you too. Another thing I wanted to talk about was, so many grief books. For those of you who have read other grief books, there are so many that do offer the great thing of, I see myself, I see that's familiar. Someone else has had a loss similar to mine. And yours also goes an extra mile and offers some things to do, which is a gap sometimes of we don't know what to do. And a lot of therapists, to be honest, aren't trained in helping people know what to do either. So this book is really helpful. And for those people who are sitting out there now and stuck and are the people who say, I'm doing it wrong, or I don't even know where to start. It's another kind of big question that can go in a lot of different ways, but what's something you can offer of a place to start when you don't know?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And thank you for saying that about my book. It was a really important choice that I made when I decided to write this book, was to do both of those things, to both hold space and normalize the broad experience of grief, and also to offer some tools that I've learned along the way, that I've learned from other people, that I've learned from myself. Not to sound cliche, and I'm not trying to self-aggrandize myself, but showing up at a grief book event feels like a good place to start. But I mean, yes, thank you for showing up for me and for Julianne, but also because that means you're already starting to think about What do I need to know more about my grief? How do I need to show up for myself? Or maybe you're here because you want to know how to show up for somebody else, right? So I don't take it lightly that people are coming out on in your free time to come to a book event on grief. So I just want you to name that. And that goes to an example of one thing I think we're going to talk about a couple, but one thing I think you can do is all of us grievers can start practicing, and I do this with my one-on-one clients all the time, making visible or naming every little baby step you do that makes you feel better, or in early grief, as my TED Talk title is called, that can make grief suck less. Because sometimes in the beginning, if you said to somebody, I want to do something or I want to feel better, that feels so inaccessible to an early griever. And also some of us have a story of, if I feel better, then I'm going to not feel so connected to my person, right? We have that story too. But part of that is people who come to me and say, I'm not doing grief right, which we all know, right? There's no right way to do grief. Okay. But they're missing naming and acknowledging all the little things they're doing. Well, I did see my doctor to try to get some help on learning how to help with sleep. Sleep is so underrated as a thing you can do. What can you do to get better sleep? Blackout curtains, sound machines, magnesium, like, I'm not prescribing anything, but or a prescription, whatever you need to do. But part of why remember that pause before the story, we get into story and saying to ourselves, I'm not doing grief right. I'm not doing enough. And that's a story that you're telling yourself that is self-fulfilling. So one tool or skill I invite people to do, I had to do this even as I navigated all the grief and all the pain that I experienced this last year and a half going through cancer treatment, is to pause and, to a friend, to my therapist, in my journal, out loud to my dog. My dog knows a lot, by the way. So like, if they can ever learn how to talk, I am in trouble. I really practice saying, like, you know what? I at least walked, I'm like an hour-long voracious walker. There were days where I wanted to make it, thankfully I live near the ocean, to see the ocean and back. And that sometimes was 2 blocks. And I could have told the story, what's wrong with me? So whatever, I only made it 2 blocks. But instead, I really intentionally started to tell the story, I made it 2 blocks. Right? So, or in your early grief, or wherever you are, if you're feeling stuck in your grief, can you start by noticing what you're already doing that makes it suck less, that makes it feel better, that's at least neutral? Because there's information there. It might be that you just need to do more of those things, and there's not a right or wrong, but you're going to try it. So maybe I'm going to try to do that 2 days a week or 3. My chapter on this in the book comes from my favorite poet, David White. Does anybody know David White? Oh, check out David White. He's a phenomenal poet. I first learned about him, I think, on Being with Krista Tippett. We're just plugging everybody else's work here. He has a poem, which is the chapter of my book, which is Start Close In. Start close in when you feel overwhelmed and you don't know what to do next. Set down the story that there's a right way, that there's a path. I just have to get here, or I just have to be able to do that. And then it's going to be okay. And then I'm going to figure it out. Can you start close in? Can you start with a mindfulness practice? Can you start with a walk around the block instead of that 1-hour walk? Can you start by showing up at a grief book event or scheduling a session with a therapist or a grief guide? Right? Can you just start close in? I think so much. And I know that I want to name that. I know the compulsion to want to have it. I mean, I'm seeing many early grieving clients right now, and you want the answer that's going to get you to that place where it doesn't suck at all. And you're going to get there, I promise. But you got to start with where it sucks a little bit less. So we got to start close in. And to do that means we have to soften the stories we tell ourselves about what we're doing and the value of the little things that we're doing, to name those little micro movements, and then to get curious about, they helped when it was with this person, like, get curious. Outings are helpful, but I learned it's not helpful if it's a big crowd. Okay, next time I'm going to try it with a smaller crowd, or next time I'm going to try it with a one-on-one. Just bring that curiosity to your grief and start close in and acknowledge what you've done. Yeah.
Yeah. Start close
You got to
in.
give yourself the gold star.
Yeah.
Give yourself the gold star.
Start close in really stayed with me. What's the next best thing? What is the thing to do now? And I
still
think
use that today.
Yeah. And I think the thing to do now is to talk to the crowd. I would love to hear, and I also want people to have a chance to meet you. So let's open it up for questions.
No, somebody's got questions. Yes.
By Emily Dickinson. And it's one of those serendipitous things of how you find something that works for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a question other than to just thank you for mentioning the poetry.
Oh, can everybody hear her? Do I need to bring the mic back or can people can hear? Okay. I just want to make sure. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Poetry is powerful, isn't it? Poetry, metaphor. I mean, the book is just chock full of metaphor and poetry. And I think poetry and metaphor, I'm curious if you feel this way. The reason I've always loved it for so long and have relied on it is it helps us get at a way of feeling or being in the world that straightforward language can't. You know, I think it was Parker Palmer or somebody said like, it allows you to get like truth told slant. It allows you to get to the soul. You know, the soul is a very shy thing and it can't handle that sort of straightforward language and metaphor and poetry. It has this subtle way of helping open us up a little more in a way that allows us to kind of be with the truth of something that you really don't have words for. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Journaling. Well, you said something really important there that I want to bring up to everybody, which is, and the language in the book reflects the language that I've used in the podcast, and which is invitation. So at the end of every chapter, there's an invitation. It's not a practice. It's not homework. Even when I see one-on-one clients, I sometimes joke, here's your homework, but it's not really homework. It's an invitation because we're not always ready for the thing. Or when we try the thing, it just doesn't land for us in that moment. And instead of saying I did it wrong or I can't do it or this tool doesn't work for me, again, if we can bring curiosity because it's an invitation, I'm going to try it. Journaling didn't really work this time. But we don't have to make a declarative statement that journaling doesn't work. It just maybe doesn't work right now, or in the format you set, or you need a private space or whatever else. And so that invitational language, I think, is really important. I use it as a provider to the people that I work with, to my podcast guests, but I would encourage you to use invitational language with yourself. And that comes back to that curiosity, like, what might I do today and try today that didn't really work in the past, but might work? Get curious about what you might try, what might make things suck a little less today. And if that's all you can get to, then that's okay too. So to kind of go back to the tools, not just the tools in my book, but any of the things, resources that work for you, to come back to them over and over again, but really with that invitational language. Yes. Mm. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah. I love that. I love that so much. Could you hear that? Yes, everybody back there. I just want to make sure because that was so beautiful. I think music, whether it's lyrical or not, symphony is not, but of course the lyrics of music is poetry, right? And metaphor, but non-lyrical music is powerful, especially if we have a history to it, but also because we are sensory beings that aren't just around, right? We are around touch and sound and smell and taste. And all of these things live in our memory, which is why you can have a grief trigger with somebody walks by who has the cologne on and you don't quite know, right? Or the music comes on in the store and it maybe isn't the song, but it reminds you of the song that you used to listen to when the thing happened. And so I love that you got curious. And though your first instinct was like, this might be too much. And it could have worked out that way, that the first time it was too much, but you were really curious and you turned towards, actually, this was something that was really meaningful. So I think I'm going to lean into it and see if this brings me some salve, right? For me, beauty is the most underrated salve. So I try to put myself in the way of beauty all the time, right? And that's a tool that I use that I wanted to mention. Yeah. You can. I already did it. I broke the tears. Anybody get the chills? Yeah. Sucks. Yeah. Giving permission for that anger. Yeah. Um, Thank you so much for sharing that. And also thank you for validating that it was okay to share about Joe. And I think that goes back to what we're saying. It's like, how do we create a more grief literate world? It's by being brave enough to share the hard thing that we're going through. Because when we do that, we give people the chance to do two things. One, help us, which the people who care about us desperately want to do. But two, we're teaching them that it's okay for them to share their hard thing, not necessarily in that moment, because then that's grief thieving and we got that's a whole chapter in the book, right? But to do that and to feel that feeling, because if you tell yourself it's not an okay feeling, that won't make it go away. It's going to show up. Yeah. 25 years later, I kind of got a flash of the 5 minutes. So I want to make sure I saw. Yes. Oh, okay. That's okay. I bet a lot of people haven't even started reading the whole book. So you might be ahead of some people. Yeah. 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 So did you guys hear that? So she said when you start talking about your grief in the beginning, people might be okay, but then you can see them doing that thing that they do where they're fidgeting and yeah. Or maybe it's the first time you tell them, but it's the second time you talk to them. You know, there's a whole chapter, there's a chapter or two in the book. One's called People Say Stupid Shit, because you know, they do. But they also say meaningful things. I'm not down on people, you guys. I love people. I'm a people. You know, I think the answer, which is probably not going to be a nice, tidy, you know, answer, is it depends, you know. So part of what I think we do when someone says something stupid, and I use that word kind of jokingly or pejoratively, but also just does something that is hurtful to us. It could, the same thing happens. We have really three choices. You know, we can ignore them, we can tell them off, right? Or we can kind of educate them. Those are our three choices. And the decision you have to make will depend on your relationship with that person and the history. If they have been somebody who in the past you've tried to educate them and they just were not willing to change their behavior, then that might be somebody you tell off or ignore if you can, depending on how they show up in your life. But if it's somebody that you believe is trying to do their best, but they've never shown up. The reason we suck at showing up for other people in their grief is because we haven't learned how to show up for ourselves in ours. Right. And so, but if it's somebody who's meaningful to you or who's in your life or going to be in your life, you do have the chance to educate them. I know it's such a pain. Like the last thing you really want to do as a griever is now be a teacher. Like, hello. But if it's a person that you think wants to, they just don't know how to, then that's a conversation you can have. As I've noticed recently that when I'm talking about my grief, I see you fidgeting and whatever, and I can imagine that it's really hard to hear. I'm just spitballing something you would say, right? And I want you to know that I see that, even though you don't say words, I feel it. And it makes me feel like you're not a safe person for me to come talk to my grief about. And so I just wanted to name that. And I wondered what you wanted to know from me and what I could learn from you about how for you to be a safer person in my life, right? The truth is, and I think probably everybody in this room who's experienced profound loss knows that the people you thought were going to show up for you don't a lot of times. And the people you never expected to show up for you do, right? And so we really have these choices. We can show up, if you have the energy to show up with compassion, I encourage you to. If you don't have the energy for compassion in this situation, also file it away for later. But to remember, they're probably not doing it on purpose. They're probably not doing it with malice. They just don't know better because they've never been taught better because they live in the same grief illiterate world that we live in. So if you can show up with a little compassion to that person who does this thing when you're talking and looks down or does whatever awkward thing, they changes the subject or starts telling you about their grief story before you've finished yours, then you might choose to educate them in a compassionate way. Hey, I don't know if you noticed, but you change the subject every time I bring up Eric, and that's really hard. Yeah. You
I
guys,
think we did it.
we did it. Wait, before everybody moves, can I get a picture of the audience, please? I'm so bad at remembering to do pictures. Should we do a?
And then she will be signing books.
I will be signing books. So if you bought one or there's still some for sale, there's still some for sale. That would be amazing. Okay. I think we should scream Milwaukee. What do you think? I'm gonna do a video and then I'll capture it. Is there a saying that we say in Milwaukee?
She's very good.
Cheese.
Who said that?
Okay, we're gonna take these. 1, 2, 3. Cheese.
Thank you to Lisa for coming to Milwaukee.
And thank you, Julianne. Has a podcast called The Art of Losing, if you don't know her, and she is a local therapist and specializes in grief and does work in workplaces, helping workplaces become more grief literate. So if you are somebody in a workplace in HR or some other capacity and you want to bring her and her colleague, Megan Riordan Jarvis, on board, she's your gal. So make sure to talk to her. Thank you. And I'm going to be signing up front. Up front.